Split the check. We are absolutely not paying for her. The words cut through the ambient, sophisticated hum of the Obsidian Prime. It was a high-end steakhouse in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where the lighting was kept intentionally dim. The jazz played softly from hidden speakers, and the prices were astronomical. Stephanie, my daughter-in-law, waved her perfectly manicured hand dismissively at the waiter. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed that sharp, piercing quality of someone who was entirely used to getting her way, regardless of whose dignity she had to trample on to achieve it. Across the heavy oak table, my son Derek did not flinch. He did not look up from his meal. He simply continued to slice his medium-rare ribeye steak, the blade of his expensive silver knife scraping softly against the pristine porcelain plate. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of agreement. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at my wife, Diane. I sat completely frozen, the heavy linen napkin gripped tightly in my lap, my knuckles turning white under the table. Beside me, Diane lowered her head. I could see the slight, uncontrollable tremor in her left hand, the side of her body that was still weakened by the mild stroke she had suffered a year ago. She was confined to a wheelchair, a bulky piece of medical equipment that Stephanie had loudly complained was taking up too much room and ruining the aesthetic of our table when we first arrived. Now Diane tried to pull her trembling hand off the white tablecloth, trying to hide her physical shame, trying desperately to shrink away and become invisible in the crowded dining room. They thought they were humiliating an old man and a disabled woman over a dinner bill. They thought they had finally worn me down, established their absolute dominance, and pushed us into the pathetic, helpless corner they believed we belonged in. But as I watched Derek swallow his expensive food, without a single shred of guilt or hesitation, a profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. They had no idea. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 60 days meticulously engineering their complete, inescapable, and absolute destruction. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to walk all over your kindness. For 40 years, I worked as a chief structural engineer right here in this city. My entire professional career was built on understanding invisible stress points, calculating massive weight loads, and knowing exactly how much pressure a concrete foundation could take before it inevitably cracked and collapsed. I spent decades designing the steel skeletons of the skyscrapers that define the Chicago skyline. I know exactly how massive things are built, and more importantly, I know exactly how they are demolished. Looking at my son right now sitting in his tailored designer suit, I realized his moral foundation had crumbled to dust a long, long time ago. I had just stubbornly refused to see the cracks because I loved him. The waiter, a young man in a crisp white shirt and a black vest, stood completely frozen at the edge of our table. His eyes darted nervously between Stephanie's glaring, impatient face and my silent, seated form. He held a black leather checkbook awkwardly in his hand, clearly panicked and unsure of how to navigate the sudden, vicious family cruelty that had just been dropped right into the middle of his Friday night shift. "I am sorry, ma'am," the waiter stammered slightly, his voice betraying his profound discomfort and embarrassment for us. "You want me to split the bill 3 ways, or—" "No," Stephanie snapped, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling, as if the young man was incredibly dense. She adjusted the heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist with a sharp flick of her hand. I noticed the way the expensive stones caught the dim restaurant light, and I knew for an absolute fact that the bracelet was far beyond what a self-proclaimed freelance interior designer and an unemployed commercial real estate broker could honestly afford. I said, "Split the check between my husband and me and them. We are not covering her food. She barely ate half of her fish anyway. It is a complete waste of our money." Derek finally looked up from his plate, picking up his linen napkin and wiping his mouth. He offered the young waiter a tight, patronizing smile, the kind he used to use on clients he thought were beneath him. "Just put my dad and my mom on a separate tab, man. It is easier that way. They are on a fixed income. You know how it is." We need to keep things completely separate for the accounting purposes. A fixed income. The arrogant words echoed loudly in my head, accompanied by a hollow, sickening, ringing sound. My mind involuntarily flashed back exactly 15 years. I pictured the gleaming cherry-red paint of my 1968 Ford Mustang. It was a classic American muscle car that I had spent an entire decade restoring with my own two bare hands. I had spent countless weekends in our cramped garage smelling of heavy motor oil and leather polish, rebuilding the engine piece by piece, bolt by bolt. It was my absolute pride and joy, my singular selfish indulgence after a long life of grinding, backbreaking work. I sold that beautiful car on a rainy Tuesday morning for $40,000 in cold cash. I did it without a second thought, without a single regret at the time, because a 25-year-old Derek had sobbed uncontrollably in my living room. He was terrified that his reckless secret credit card debt was going to get him sued and permanently ruin his chances of graduating from his elite business program. I handed him that envelope of money to wipe his slate clean. I willingly gave up a piece of my soul so my only son could have a fresh start. And now here he sat in a restaurant where they charged $90 for a single piece of meat, allowing his arrogant wife to publicly declare that they would not pay $30 for his disabled mother's salmon. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the betrayal was almost breathtaking. If I were a lesser man, if I were the frail, confused 70-year-old victim they desperately wanted me to be, I might have yelled. I might have caused a massive scene, slammed my fists violently on the heavy oak table, or broken down in tears of heartbreak and public humiliation. I could feel the hot, bitter sting of anger burning in the back of my throat, demanding to be let out, demanding immediate vengeance. But engineers do not throw tantrums. Engineers observe, they calculate the variables, and they execute the plan. I turned my head slightly and looked down at Diane, my beautiful, resilient wife of 45 years. The woman who had packed Derek's school lunches every single morning, who had stayed up all night putting cold washcloths on his forehead when he had the flu, who had cheered the loudest and cried the hardest at his college graduation. She was staring down at her lap, a single silent tear slipping down her wrinkled cheek and dropping onto her lovely silk blouse. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, trying desperately to pretend she had not heard the dripping venom in Stephanie's voice. That single tear was the final, undeniable signature on their death warrant. Any lingering shred of paternal hesitation or forgiveness I held on to evaporated instantly into thin air. I reached out across the table and gently placed my hand over Diane's trembling fingers. I gave her hand a firm, reassuring squeeze. I did not look at her with pity. I looked at her with a silent, ironclad promise. Then I slowly shifted my gaze back to the terrified waiter. The young man was still standing there, looking like he wanted the polished wooden floor to open up and swallow him whole. He had his silver pen hovering nervously over his notepad, waiting for my confirmation to split the bill and finalize the humiliation. Stephanie sighed loudly and dramatically, leaning back into the cushions of her plush leather chair. Honestly, she muttered, picking up her crystal wineglass by the delicate stem, it is always a whole huge production with them. I told you we should have just gone out with my friends for Mother's Day. Instead, Derek, this is exhausting. Derek murmured a low agreement, casually swirling the remaining dark red wine in his glass. Sorry, Dad, he said, his tone completely devoid of any actual sorrow or respect. You know how tight the commercial real estate market is right now. We just have to be really careful with our budget this month. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply picked up my own napkin, carefully wiped the corners of my mouth, and folded the linen square, neatly placing it right beside my plate. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, letting the absolute clarity of my destructive plan crystallize perfectly in my mind. I looked directly at the waiter. There will be no need to split the check, I said. My voice was steady, deep, and resonating with a quiet, dangerous authority that commanded the immediate attention of our small corner of the dining room. Just hold on to it for a few more minutes. We are not quite finished here. Stephanie let out a sharp, mocking, incredulous laugh. Not finished. What are you going to order a piece of cake now? Because like I just explicitly said, we are not paying for it. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms comfortably on the edge of the table. I looked directly into Stephanie's eyes past the heavy expensive makeup and the feigned superiority right down into the shallow, greedy, rotting core of her being. Then I looked at my son, making absolutely sure he saw the complete absence of paternal warmth in my expression. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the cold, calculated, terrifying smile of a man who was about to trigger an explosive charge that had been meticulously planted at the very foundation of their comfortable lives. Oh. I think we have plenty of time before dessert, I replied softly. They thought this was about a dinner bill. They thought they were the ones in absolute control. But as I sat there watching them bask in their petty, pathetic cruelty, I knew something they did not. The real bill was coming, and it was going to cost them absolutely everything. The nervous young waiter shifted his weight heavily from one foot to the other. He looked down at the black leather checkbook in his hand, as if it were a live grenade. The poor kid was clearly caught in the crossfire of a brutal family war he did not understand, and I honestly almost felt sorry for him. I raised my hand just an inch from the table, a subtle gesture of command I had perfected over decades of directing chaotic construction sites. "Just give us a moment, son," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and polite. "There is no need to rush the transaction. We have some family business to conclude before any plastic is swiped tonight." Stephanie let out a long theatrical groan. She tossed her head back, making sure the dim restaurant lighting caught the artificial blonde highlights in her hair. "Are you kidding me right now?" she muttered, leaning across the table toward Derek. She did not even bother to lower her voice. "This is exactly why I hate going out to dinner with them. Old people are always so agonizingly slow with math. They probably need to count their pennies to make sure they have enough to cover a decent tip. Which, by the way, we are not subsidizing." Derek gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Just let him figure it out, Steph. You know how he gets when he tries to feel like the man of the house. The man of the house." The phrase tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. I did not react to the insult. Instead, I let my gaze drift down to Stephanie's left arm. As she reached for her crystal water glass, her silk sleeve pulled back, revealing a thick, glittering tennis bracelet. It was a stunning piece of jewelry, consisting of dozens of perfectly cut, flawless diamonds set in heavy platinum. My mind, trained for decades to calculate costs, assess materials, and evaluate structural integrity, immediately appraised the item. That bracelet was not a cheap imitation or a clever cubic zirconia fake. I knew the absolute difference. I had spent months researching high-grade diamonds for Diane's 40th anniversary ring a decade ago. I knew exactly how light refracted through genuine carbon. That piece on Stephanie's wrist retailed for no less than $30,000. A cold, highly analytical part of my brain began to process the glaring financial inconsistencies sitting right in front of me. Here was a woman who proudly claimed to be a freelance interior designer, but had not completed a single verifiable paying project in over a year. She spent her days curating a completely fake life on social media, posting carefully filtered photos of luxury beach vacations and custom designer clothes that absolutely did not match their stated tax brackets. And sitting right next to her was my son, a man who had recently sat in my living room and complained bitterly about the crushing weight of the frozen commercial real estate market, claiming they were barely scraping by on their monthly mortgage payments. Yet she was wearing the equivalent of a luxury car on her wrist, and the sleek, brand-new imported German sedan they had driven to the restaurant tonight was currently parked with the valet out front. The math did not add up. And if there is one thing a structural engineer absolutely despises, it is an equation that does not balance. When the numbers on a blueprint do not match the physical reality of the steel and concrete, it means the entire building is going to collapse. It means someone is lying on the safety reports. It means a catastrophic disaster is imminent. For a very long time, I had ignored the subtle warning signs. I had intentionally played the role of the willfully blind, unconditionally loving father, choosing to believe that Derek was just going through a rough patch in his career, that Stephanie was just a bit overly materialistic, but ultimately harmless. I had made endless excuses for their frequently canceled visits, their forgotten birthdays, and their blatant growing lack of respect for Diane's medical condition. I had desperately convinced myself that this was simply the modern dynamic of young, busy professionals trying to make it in a harsh world. I had been a fool, a sentimental, hopeful, pathetic fool. I watched Diane carefully pick up her water glass with her good hand. She kept her tired eyes focused strictly on the melting ice cubes floating in the glass, terrified to make direct eye contact with the monsters sitting across from us. She was a woman who had given every single ounce of her maternal love, every drop of her energy to a boy who had grown up to treat her like a discarded, burdensome piece of garbage. She had worked double shifts at the local elementary school for 20 years just to make sure he had the best tutors, the best sports equipment, and every possible advantage we could afford to give him. Seeing her reduced to this state of quiet, trembling terror ignited a righteous fury inside me that burned much hotter than any industrial forge I had ever stood beside. They thought my prolonged silence was a sign of absolute submission. They thought my calm, quiet demeanor was a clear symptom of an aging, slowing mind. They fatally mistook my patience for weakness. They assumed that because my hair had turned gray and my joints sometimes ached in the cold Chicago winters, my brain had somehow lost its sharp analytical edge. They believed they were the brilliant predators, and we were just the slow, easy prey waiting to be devoured. But I was not slow. I was calculating. I was meticulously aligning the final load, bearing columns of the trap they had so willingly walked into. As Stephanie continued to complain under her breath, scrolling mindlessly on her expensive smartphone, and ignoring the world around her, I took a slow sip of my water. The ice was freezing against my teeth. The restaurant around us buzzed with the lively, happy chatter of other families celebrating the holiday, completely oblivious to the silent, invisible execution about to take place at our table. I needed them to feel completely secure for just a few minutes longer. I needed them to reach the absolute dizzying peak of their arrogance before I violently kicked the fragile foundation out from under them. Because the punishment had to perfectly fit the crime, and their crime was an act of profound, unforgivable betrayal against the very people who gave them life. To understand the sheer magnitude of what they had done, to understand why a father who once sacrificed his own dreams for his child was now sitting in a luxury steakhouse preparing to send his only son to a federal penitentiary. We cannot start at the end of the story. The cruel insults tonight were merely the final, ugly symptoms of a much deeper, far more insidious disease that had infected our family tree. We have to rewind the clock. We have to leave this dimly lit, expensive dining room with its jazz music and its $90 steaks and go back to the exact moment the fatal structural flaw was introduced into the architecture of our lives. We have to trace the rot back to its absolute source. To understand why I was about to send my only son to prison, we have to go back exactly 62 days. The day Derek brought me the paperwork that sealed his fate. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday afternoon in early March, exactly 62 days before our disastrous dinner at the steakhouse. I was in the front yard slowly sweeping the last of the dead winter leaves off the concrete walkway. Diane was sitting in her wheelchair on the small wooden front porch, a thick wool blanket draped carefully over her legs to protect her from the lingering chill in the air. She was smiling, watching a pair of robins build a nest in the old oak tree near the sidewalk. Then the heavy, aggressive hum of a high-performance engine shattered the peaceful afternoon. A sleek, midnight black, brand-new BMW glided onto our driveway. I stopped sweeping, watching the expensive vehicle with mild surprise and instinctual caution. Derek and Stephanie rarely visited us without a specific, self-serving reason. The driver's side door swung open, and Derek stepped out. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. He adjusted his silk tie and flashed me a bright, practiced smile that did not quite reach his eyes. From the passenger side, Stephanie emerged wearing oversized designer sunglasses and carrying a small, elegant white bakery box tied with a gold ribbon. They walked up the driveway together, moving in perfect, arrogant synchronization, as if they owned the very ground they walked upon. They looked entirely out of place standing in front of my modest, weathered aluminum siding and overgrown rose bushes. Dad, Derek called out with artificial enthusiasm. "Still doing yard work. You should really be taking it easy." I set the broom down deliberately, making sure not to show any outward signs of my suddenly accelerated heart rate. "To what do we owe this unexpected pleasure?" I asked, keeping my tone carefully neutral. "We were just in the neighborhood looking at some commercial properties," Stephanie chimed in, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She walked briskly past me and headed straight for the porch. "Oh, Diane, look at you sitting out here in the cold." Stephanie cooed, her voice adopting that high-pitched, patronizing tone people usually reserve for small toddlers or confused pets. "I brought you a special treat for the afternoon." She held up the pristine white bakery box. "I remembered you are supposed to be watching your sugar after the stroke, so I went completely out of my way to find this specialized organic bakery downtown. I got you some gluten-free, sugar-free oat bran muffins. They are incredibly healthy." Diane offered a polite, strained smile and thanked her softly, reaching out with her good hand to take the box. I knew for a fact that Diane hated oat bran, and her stroke had absolutely nothing to do with her blood sugar levels, but we both knew better than to correct Stephanie when she was aggressively playing the role of the thoughtful, caring daughter-in-law. While Stephanie hovered over Diane, acting out a theatrical display of false affection, Derek placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was a little too tight, a subtle physical attempt to establish dominance. "Dad, it is actually really good that we caught you home," Derek said, his voice dropping an octave into a serious professional register. "Do you have a few minutes to talk privately? There is some important family business I have been meaning to run past you." I looked from Derek to Stephanie, then down at Diane, who was dutifully pretending to admire a dry, joyless muffin. A cold knot of suspicion instantly formed in the pit of my stomach, but I simply nodded. "Sure, come on inside," I said. We walked through the narrow hallway of the house I had owned for 40 years, past the framed photographs of Derek's childhood, and stepped into my cramped back study. The room was my personal sanctuary, filled with towering stacks of structural engineering blueprints, worn reference manuals, and the lingering smell of old paper and drafting lead. Derek looked around the room with a brief, barely concealed expression of distaste, as if the physical evidence of my lifelong blue-collar profession was somehow embarrassing to him. He sat down heavily in the worn leather armchair opposite my desk and unbuttoned his expensive suit jacket. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, legal-sized folder. He placed it carefully on my cluttered desk, right on top of a set of bridge schematics I had been reviewing for an old colleague. "What is this?" I asked, sitting down slowly in my rolling chair. Derek leaned forward, clasping his manicured hands together. He looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured concern. "Dad, I have been talking to some top-tier wealth management guys at my firm. The financial landscape is shifting rapidly. The state of Illinois just passed some absolutely brutal new estate tax laws, and the federal government is heavily auditing middle-class retirement accounts. I have been losing sleep worrying about you and Mom. You worked your entire life to build your nest egg, and I cannot stand the thought of the government swooping in and taxing half of it away if something unexpected happens to your health." I stared at the thick manila folder, then back up at his earnest, lying face. "So what is your proposed solution?" I asked quietly. Derek smiled, sensing that I was taking the bait. He opened the folder and slid a dense, heavily worded legal document toward me. "It is a comprehensive power of attorney specifically tailored for medical and financial delegation. If you and Mom sign this, it gives me the legal authority to shield your assets in a protected trust. I can actively manage your investment portfolio, handle all the confusing tax loopholes, and most importantly, I can take over all the frustrating medical billing for Mom's ongoing stroke treatments." He paused, letting his words hang in the quiet air of the study. He looked directly into my eyes, playing his final emotional card. "Dad, you have carried this family on your back for decades. You sacrificed everything to put me through school, It is my turn to step up and take care of you. I want to handle all the stressful financial burdens, so you and Mom can finally just relax and enjoy your golden years, without any worries. I looked down at the document. The bold black letters across the top clearly read, "Durable power of attorney for healthcare and property." It was a complete unconditional surrender of all my earthly rights. He was asking me to voluntarily hand over the keys to my entire life under the thin, sweet disguise of a son wanting to protect his aging parents. I looked back up at Derek. His eyes were wide, clear, and perfectly deceitful. He honestly believed I was just a tired, worn-out old man who would blindly sign away my autonomy out of fear and gratitude. He thought his smooth, rehearsed corporate pitch had worked flawlessly on his unsuspecting father. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed a master blueprint to a man who spent his entire life looking for hidden structural flaws. I reached across the cluttered desk and picked up my reading glasses, unfolding the wire frames with slow, deliberate movements. I slipped them onto my face and pulled the heavy manila folder closer, opening the thick stack of legal papers. Derek sat back in the leather chair, crossing his legs and checking his expensive watch, trying to project an air of casual patience. But I noticed the slight, rapid tapping of his polished dress shoe against the hardwood floor. He was nervous. He needed this signed today. For 40 years, I had read complex engineering schematics where a single misplaced decimal point or a misunderstood load-bearing calculation could result in the catastrophic collapse of a skyscraper. My brain was permanently wired to scan for anomalies, to hunt down the microscopic weaknesses hidden within dense pages of technical jargon. Legal documents are no different from blueprints. They both build a structure. You just have to follow the lines of force to see who holds the weight and who holds the power. I began to read, scanning past the standard boilerplate language about financial management and tax shielding. But on page 4, halfway down a dense paragraph of legalese, I found the first hairline fracture. It was a clause buried under the heading of real property management. It did not just give Derek the ability to manage the house. It explicitly granted him the unilateral authority to mortgage, sell, transfer, or completely liquidate any and all real estate assets owned by the signatories without requiring any further notification or consent. My blood ran ice cold, but I kept my breathing perfectly even. I turned the page. The second fracture was even worse. Under the section labeled Healthcare Directives, there was a specific provision that bypassed standard medical consultation. It granted Derek the sole, uncontestable right to place both Diane and me into long-term care facilities, psychiatric institutions, or state-run nursing homes, completely overriding any medical proxy I had previously set up for my wife. It was not a safety net. It was a loaded gun pointed directly at our freedom. I did not look up immediately. I kept my eyes focused on the crisp white paper, carefully managing my facial expression. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal sitting on my desk was staggering. He was not trying to help us manage our retirement. He was trying to completely strip us of our property and our physical autonomy. He wanted the legal right to sell the house right out from under us and lock his mother away in a facility where he would never have to deal with her again. I took a slow breath, channeling the calm, authoritative voice I used to use during hostile contractor disputes. Derek, Thirty said, tapping my index finger gently against page 4. This section here about real property. It says you would have the right to sell the house without my signature. I thought we were just setting up a protected trust for the taxes. Why would you need the power to liquidate the family home? Derek stopped tapping his foot. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at me with a practiced expression of mild exasperation, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. Dad, you are overthinking the phrasing, he said smoothly. It is just standard legal jargon. Boilerplate stuff that the lawyers throw into every comprehensive power of attorney just to cover all possible bases. Nobody is trying to sell your house. I slowly turned to page 5. And this part about medical institutionalization, I pressed gently. It says you can commit us to a facility unilaterally. Your mother already has a primary care physician who manages her stroke recovery. Why do you need this specific medical override? Derek sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked deeply offended that I would even question his motives. Dad. God forbid, what if you have a massive heart attack tomorrow and end up in a coma? What if Mom has another stroke and the local hospital cannot handle her specific needs? If I do not have absolute legal authority, the state can step in and freeze everything. I could be tied up in probate court for months, just trying to get Mom into a decent rehabilitation center. He paused, letting the fear of the unknown sink in. Then he played his trump card. Besides, you know, Stephanie is a licensed professional in the real estate market. She knows exactly how to protect property values and structure these things to maximize your equity. If years from now you guys decide you want to downsize and move to a smaller condo, having this paperwork already filed just makes the entire process incredibly smooth and painless. Stephanie even had one of her senior brokers look over this exact contract. I looked out the window of the study. Through the glass, I could see Stephanie standing on the front porch, impatiently checking her phone while she completely ignored Diane. She was probably calculating the exact square footage of the property, mentally spending the commission she would make from selling my home. They had rehearsed this performance perfectly. They thought they had backed the clueless old man into an inescapable legal corner, relying on my love to blind me to their actual intentions. I looked back at Derek. His eyes were wide with manufactured sincerity. I knew that if I refused to sign the document right now, he would panic. He would change his strategy, and he might try to force my hand through more aggressive legal avenues before I had a chance to prepare. I needed to trap him in a false sense of security. I needed him to believe he had won. I let out a heavy sigh, purposefully slumping my shoulders to project exhaustion. You make a good point, son, I murmured softly. I suppose the world is changing faster than I can keep up with. You know how these modern financial systems work better than an old man like me. I just want to make sure your mother is taken care of. Derek smiled, a genuine flash of greedy triumph breaking through his careful facade. That is exactly what I am trying to do, Dad, he said softly, sliding a heavy silver pen across the desk toward me. Just sign at the bottom of the last 3 pages and initial the margins. I will take it straight to the notary at my office and get it officially filed before the weekend. I reached out to pick up the pen. As my fingers closed around the cold metal barrel, I intentionally let my hand shake violently. I grimaced in feigned pain, slowly massaging my aching knuckles. Just my arthritis flaring up again, I lied, putting on a highly convincing show of physical weakness. My grip is simply not what it used to be. I gripped the pen very awkwardly. As I dragged the ink across the white paper, I executed a subtle, calculated legal sabotage. I deliberately misspelled my own middle name and wrote the wrong year. I needed time. I handed the heavy silver pen back to Derek. He did not bother to check the signature or the date. He was too eager, too consumed by his own impending victory, to notice the microscopic flaws I had intentionally woven into the foundation of his legal trap. He quickly gathered the papers, slid them back into his sleek leather briefcase, and snapped the brass locks shut. A look of profound relief washed over his face. It was the look of a desperate man who had just managed to plug a massive hole in a rapidly sinking ship. He promised to call me later that week, and hurried out of the study without another word. I sat alone in the quiet room for a long time, listening to the heavy hum of their imported car speeding away down the street. I had successfully bought myself a small window of time. But time alone was not enough. I needed concrete data. I needed to understand exactly why my son was suddenly so desperate to seize control of my entire life. Over the next 3 weeks, I transformed my quiet retirement into an active, meticulous surveillance operation. I stopped taking Derek at his word and started watching the details of his life with the same cold, analytical precision I used to inspect stress fractures in steel beams. The discrepancies began to pile up almost immediately, forming a very clear and deeply disturbing pattern. Whenever Derek called me on the phone, he made a point to complain bitterly about his personal finances. He would talk for an hour about how the commercial real estate market was completely frozen. He claimed his firm was cutting commissions, that wealthy buyers were pulling out of deals at the last minute, and that he and Stephanie were barely managing to keep up with their massive monthly mortgage payments. He painted a very convincing picture of a young couple struggling against a harsh, unforgiving economy. But the physical evidence told a completely different story. Diane loved to use her electronic tablet to look at pictures of our extended family on social media. One afternoon, while I was sitting next to her on the sofa, she handed me the tablet to show me a picture Stephanie had just posted online. It was a photograph of Stephanie sitting at a high-end outdoor cafe, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and casually holding a bright orange leather handbag. I did not know much about modern fashion, but I knew luxury materials when I saw them. Out of sheer curiosity, I took the tablet back to my study and did some basic research on the internet. It took me less than 10 minutes to identify the specific handbag. It was a highly exclusive luxury item. The specific model she was casually displaying on the table retailed for no less than $25,000. There was a massive, glaring structural failure in their sad story. You do not constantly complain to your elderly parents about struggling to pay your basic mortgage while your wife parades around the city carrying the equivalent of a down payment on her arm. The basic financial math was fundamentally broken. The final piece of the terrible puzzle fell into place on a quiet Sunday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks before the disastrous dinner. Derek had come over to the house under the pretense of helping me clean out the rain gutters, but he had conveniently forgotten his work gloves. Instead of helping me, he spent the entire afternoon sitting in my living room, drinking my expensive scotch and watching a professional football game on the television. I was sitting in my worn armchair across from him, pretending to read a thick biography of a famous architect. In reality, I was watching his every single move. Derek was completely absorbed in the game. He was incredibly restless, constantly shifting his weight on the sofa, chewing nervously on his fingernails. His smartphone was sitting face up on the wooden coffee table right between us. Around 3 o'clock, the team he was rooting for threw an interception. Derek cursed under his breath and stood up abruptly to go to the kitchen to pour himself another large glass of scotch. He left his phone resting on the table. A few seconds after he walked away and disappeared down the hallway, the screen of the phone suddenly lit up with a bright, silent notification. I slowly lowered my book and leaned forward in my chair. My eyesight was not quite what it used to be, but the bold black text on the bright white screen was absolutely impossible to miss. It was a text message from a number that was not saved in his personal contacts. The message was short, brutal, and completely lacking any professional courtesy. It read, "Your extension is officially over. We want our money by the end of the month, or we stop calling and start visiting. Do not make us come find you." I sat completely frozen in my chair, staring hard at the glowing screen until it slowly faded back to black. The cold, ugly reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was not a friendly reminder from a local bank or a standard credit card company. Legitimate financial institutions do not send threatening text messages on a Sunday afternoon. They send formal letters on heavy stock paper. They use polite, legally approved language. The menacing message on Derek's phone was the unmistakable language of the dangerous shadow economy. It was the specific language of high-risk predatory lenders. These were aggressive men who operated far outside the normal bounds of the traditional legal system. These were men who absolutely did not care about your excuses, your career, or your family. They only cared about getting their money back with massive, crippling interest attached. Suddenly, everything made perfect, terrifying sense to me. The sudden, unannounced visit, the desperate attempt to get the power of attorney signed quickly, the hidden legal clause about liquidating the real estate. Derek was not trying to protect my retirement fund from state taxes like a good son. He was drowning in a massive, unseen ocean of dangerous debt, and he was desperately trying to use my life savings as a personal life raft. He was perfectly willing to sell the very roof over my head and throw his disabled mother into a cheap state-run facility just to save his own skin from the violent consequences of his financial recklessness. I heard Derek's heavy footsteps walking back down the hallway. I quickly raised the thick biography back up, obscuring my line of sight. He sat back down heavily on the sofa, picked up his phone, and read the message. I watched his face drain of all natural color. He tried to force a fake smile, making a casual comment about the football game. I simply nodded once, maintaining my calm exterior. He had absolutely no idea that his entire pathetic web of carefully constructed financial lies was rapidly unraveling right in front of his own blind eyes. It was time to start digging directly into the dirt. I had the motive, but I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go. The universe decided to show me the absolute depths of their depravity just 3 days later. It was a Thursday afternoon. I told Derek and Stephanie I was driving across town to the pharmacy to pick up blood pressure medication for Diane. Usually, this afternoon trip took at least 2 hours due to heavy commuter traffic on the interstate highway. But by a stroke of luck, the highway was miraculously clear. I made the round trip in less than 45 minutes. I pulled my truck halfway up the driveway, deciding to leave it running while I ran inside to drop off the bag. The sky was dull gray, casting somber shadows across the lawn. I unlocked the front door as quietly as possible, not wanting to wake Diane if she had managed to fall asleep. The house was completely disturbingly silent. At least that is what I thought at first. As I took off my work boots in the entryway, careful not to make a sound, I heard a sharp, aggressive hissing noise coming from the back kitchen. It was not the familiar sound of a boiling kettle or a running faucet. It was the sound of a human voice compressed with pure, venomous rage, forced through tightly clenched teeth. I left my boots by the door and walked silently down the carpeted hallway in my thick socks. Every single step felt unnaturally heavy, my heart pounding a steady warning rhythm against my ribs. The kitchen door was pushed halfway open, casting a narrow sliver of light across the hallway floor. I pressed my back against the plaster wall and angled my head to look through the crack near the hinges. What I saw in that room permanently shattered whatever fragile remnants of a father's love I still carried. Diane was sitting in her wheelchair, pushed aggressively against the lower cabinets near the sink. On the linoleum floor, directly between her wheels, was a shattered glass water pitcher and a massive puddle of spilled water. Diane was trembling violently, her good hand gripping the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Standing directly over her, invading her personal space with an aggressive, looming posture, was Stephanie. Stephanie did not look anything like the polished interior designer she pretended to be for the cameras. Her face was twisted into an ugly, hateful, predatory sneer. She was pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly into my wife's face, her voice a low, terrifying whisper, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage without echoing through the empty house. "Look at what you did, you clumsy, useless old woman," Stephanie hissed, her tone dripping with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Do you have any idea how much this floor costs to maintain? Of course you do not. You just sit here all day long staring at the walls, soaking up Derek's money and my patience. You are nothing but a crippled leech sucking the life out of this family." Diane tried to speak, a soft, broken apology forming on her trembling lips, but Stephanie violently cut her off, slapping her flat palm down hard on the kitchen counter. The loud smack echoed off the tiled walls like a gunshot. "Shut up," Stephanie snarled, leaning even closer to Diane's face. "I am entirely sick of hearing your pathetic whining voice. I am sick of looking at your sad, drooping face every time we are forced to come over here. You think you are safe in this little suburban bubble, but you are not. Derek and I are finalizing the legal paperwork right now. Once we have the absolute legal authority over your medical care, I promise you I am going to personally pack your cheap, ugly clothes. I am going to put you in a state facility so far away that Derek will not even bother to visit on the major holidays. You are going to rot in a cheap home that smells like bleach and urine, surrounded by people who do not even know their own names. And we are going to sell this pathetic, outdated house and finally live the life we actually deserve. Do you understand me? You are absolutely finished. A thick black wave of murderous anger crashed over my entire vision. My hands curled into tight, rigid fists. Every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to kick the wooden door open to grab that cruel, arrogant woman by her expensive designer jacket and physically throw her out onto the street. I wanted to destroy her right there in my own kitchen. I wanted to make her feel the exact same terror she was inflicting on my paralyzed wife. But the cold, rational part of my brain, the part that had spent 40 years analyzing catastrophic structural failures, slammed the emergency brakes. If I exploded right now, I would immediately reveal my hand. I would give them the exact excuse they desperately needed to call the police and claim I was having an aggressive, senile episode. They would use my righteous anger to instantly validate their fake legal narrative in a court of law. I had to swallow the poison. I had to absorb the massive structural blow without breaking. I took a deep, silent breath, forcing my fists to uncurl finger by finger. I stepped backward deliberately, bumping my shoulder loudly against the hallway wall. I cleared my throat and let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh, making sure my footsteps were loud and clumsy on the wooden floorboards as I approached the kitchen door. "Hello," I called out, pitching my voice to sound completely cheerful. "I am back early?" As I pushed the kitchen door open, Stephanie spun around. The hateful sneer vanished, replaced instantly by an expression of exaggerated concern. She dropped to her knees on the wet linoleum, completely ignoring the water soaking her expensive pants, and began frantically picking up the broken glass. "Oh, Richard," she gasped, looking up with deceitful eyes. "Thank goodness you are home. Diane just had a little accident." She tried to pour some water and the pitcher slipped. "It is fine, though. I am getting it cleaned up. You just go sit down and relax." I looked deeply into Diane's eyes. They were wide with raw, unspoken terror, silently pleading with me not to start a physical war that she could not possibly fight. I looked at Stephanie, offering her a warm, hollow smile. "Thank you, Stephanie," I said, ensuring my voice remained perfectly steady. "You are always so good to her." I walked over, gently unlocked the metal brakes on the wheelchair, and carefully rolled my wife out of the cold, sterile kitchen. As I pushed her down the hallway, a profound shift occurred inside my mind. The kind, forgiving father was officially dead. The cold, calculating engineer had fully taken over. They had handed the blueprints of their own destruction directly to the man who built the foundation. It was no longer just about stopping their terrible plan. It was finally time to completely demolish the building from the inside out. That night, I waited in the absolute darkness of our bedroom until I was completely certain Diane had fallen into a deep, medicated sleep. I lay flat on my back, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing, carefully matching my own inhalations to hers. The air in the room felt incredibly heavy, thick with the unspoken horrors of the afternoon. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Stephanie standing over my wife, her face twisted in that vile, predatory snarl. I heard the sickening sound of her hand slapping the countertop, echoing like a gavel sentencing my wife to a slow, miserable death in a state-run facility. I carefully pulled the heavy cotton quilt back inch by inch, ensuring the mattress springs did not creak. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and placed my bare feet onto the cold, hardwood floor. I did not turn on any lamps. After 40 years in this house, I knew the exact distance of every single piece of furniture, the precise location of every floorboard that was prone to groaning under pressure. I moved through the silent hallways like a ghost, a phantom in my own home, driven entirely by a cold, mechanical necessity. I stepped into my back study and softly clicked the door shut behind me, engaging the heavy brass lock. The room was bathed in the pale, silvery light of the full moon, filtering through the narrow window blinds. I walked over to the large Persian rug, positioned directly behind my heavy oak desk. I knelt down the cold floor, biting into my knees, and rolled the heavy woven fabric back tightly. Beneath it was a square section of hardwood that looked perfectly identical to the rest of the floor. But I knew the precise pressure points. I pressed my thumbs hard against two specific knots in the wood, and a small panel popped loose, revealing the dull gray steel dial of a commercial-grade floor safe. I had installed this safe myself nearly 3 decades ago. It was encased in 2 feet of solid poured concrete, utterly impervious to firewater and brute force. It was the physical manifestation of my obsession with structural security. I placed my fingertips on the cold metal dial. 3 turns to the right. Past 40, stop on 12. 2 turns to the left. Stop on 87. 1 turn right. Stop on 33. The heavy steel locking mechanism disengaged with a deep, satisfying metallic thud. I pulled the heavy door open. The air inside the safe smelled of old paper, stagnant air, and copper. Inside sat the physical history of my life. There were stacks of emergency cash wrapped in thick rubber bands, our original marriage certificate, the velvet box containing Diane's grandmother's wedding ring, and the pristine folded title to my beloved long-gone Mustang. There were also the original architectural drawings of this very house, the home they were now plotting to steal. But I was not looking for memories or emergency funds tonight. I reached past the stacks of bills and pulled out a small rectangular metal lockbox from the very back. I opened it and removed 2 specific items. The first was a cheap, dark gray, prepaid cellular phone still wrapped in its original plastic casing. The second was a heavily worn, slightly yellowed business card. I stood up slowly, joints popping in the quiet room, and walked over to my desk chair. I turned on the small brass reading lamp, angling the shade so it cast a tight, narrow pool of yellow light directly onto the desk surface. I placed the business card directly under the light. There was no company logo on the card, no fancy graphics or catchy slogans. It simply had a name printed in stark, plain black ink: Mitchell. Below his name was a single local phone number. In the massive high-stakes world of Chicago commercial construction, millions of dollars routinely change hands, and corrupt contractors constantly try to cut corners to line their own pockets. They use substandard steel, they forge safety inspection reports, and they set up complex, untraceable dummy corporations to hide stolen funds. When you are managing a project worth $500 million, you cannot afford to rely on local police or slow corporate lawyers when someone starts stealing the foundation right out from under you. You need a man who knows how to operate in the gray areas. You need someone who can follow the money through solid concrete walls and digital labyrinths. Mitchell was a forensic accountant and a private investigator. But those polite titles did not even begin to accurately describe what he actually did. Mitchell was a predator who hunted white-collar criminals for a living. He was a brilliant, ruthless, entirely unapologetic man who dismantled financial lies with the same brutal efficiency that a wrecking ball uses to bring down a condemned building. We had worked together closely 15 years ago when a massive steel supplier tried to defraud my firm by substituting low-grade materials. Mitchell did not just find the missing money, he systematically destroyed the supplier's entire professional life. He unearthed hidden offshore accounts, exposed widespread bribery, and ensured the executives involved never worked in the state of Illinois again. He was a dangerous man to know, and an even more dangerous man to owe a favor to. But I did not need a friendly family lawyer to mediate a peaceful resolution. I needed a demolition expert. I tore the plastic packaging off the cheap prepaid phone. I plugged it into the wall outlet near my desk and waited for the small digital screen to flicker to life. The bright artificial light illuminated the deep, tired lines on my face in the reflection of the window pane. I punched in the 10-digit number from the business card. I did not care that it was currently 3 o'clock in the morning. A man like Mitchell was never truly off the clock. The line rang exactly twice before a voice answered. It was a deep, raspy voice sounding like gravel grinding against rusted iron. "Yes," the voice said simply. No greeting, no confusion about the late hour. Just a sharp, immediate readiness. "Mitchell," and I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "It is Richard. It has been a very long time." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I heard the faint sound of a lighter clicking, followed by a slow exhale of cigarette smoke. Richard Mitchell replied, his tone shifting only slightly to indicate recognition. The engineer who refused to sign off on the compromised steel beams in the South Loop. I thought you retired, my friend. I thought you were spending your days sitting on a porch and drinking lemonade. I am, I replied, staring blankly at the dark window. But I have encountered a new structural problem. A very personal one. Another pause. The silence stretching between us was heavy with understanding. Men like us did not call each other at 3 a.m. to catch up on old times. How big is the problem, Richard? They are trying to seize my entire estate, I stated coldly, laying the raw, ugly truth out in the open. They are trying to legally strip my property, steal my retirement, and have my wife committed to a state psychiatric ward so they can liquidate everything to cover their own hidden debts. The line was deadly silent for a long moment. When Mitchell finally spoke, his voice was entirely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. It was the voice of a man locking onto a target. Who is they, Richard? My son. I answered the words, leaving a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. My son and his wife. Mitchell exhaled another long breath of smoke. Family. Family jobs are always the messiest. They leave a lot of blood on the floor. Are you absolutely certain you want to pull this thread, Richard? Because once I start pulling, the entire sweater comes completely apart. There is no going back once I find out what they are hiding. You cannot unsee it. I looked down at my hands. These hands had built massive, enduring structures. They had also willingly handed over my life savings to a boy who had grown into a monster. I am not looking to save the sweater, Mitchell. I want you to burn it to ashes. Understood, Mitchell said, his tone turning crisp and completely professional. I need names, social security numbers, banking institutions, and every single piece of paper they have asked you to sign. Meet me at the old diner on Halsted Street tomorrow morning at 7 sharp. Bring cash. Do not use your regular phone to contact me again. I will be there, I said. I ended the call and placed the small plastic phone carefully into the top drawer of my desk. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the profound silence of the house wash over me again. The initial shock of the betrayal had finally passed, replaced entirely by a cold, calculating determination. Derek thought he was a brilliant shark swimming in the shallow waters of commercial real estate. He thought he was playing a highly sophisticated game of chess against a blind, defenseless old man. He had no idea that I had just invited a leviathan into the water. The trap was set, the lock was turned, and the absolute destruction of their lives was now completely inevitable. I arrived at the diner on Halsted Street exactly 10 minutes before 7 in the morning. It was a bleak, heavily weathered brick building sitting under the rusted iron tracks of the elevated train. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, burnt grease, and old rain. It was the exact kind of place where men went when they wanted to remain entirely unseen. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the far back corner, keeping my back to the peeling wallpaper, and my eyes firmly on the heavy glass entrance door. At precisely 7 sharp, the door swung open. Mitchell walked in. He had not changed much in 15 years. He still wore a rumpled gray trench coat and carried a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a war. His face was lined with deep, harsh creases, the physical markers of a man who spent his entire life staring into the darkest, ugliest corners of human greed. He slid into the booth opposite me without offering a handshake or a polite morning greeting. He placed his heavy briefcase on the sticky formica table and unlatched the brass locks with a sharp, echoing snap. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a thick, plain white envelope containing $10,000 in unmarked, non-sequential $100 bills. I slid the envelope slowly across the table. Mitchell did not even bother to open it or count the money. He simply slipped it into his deep coat pocket in one fluid, practiced motion. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a single thin manila folder. He did not hand it to me immediately. He rested his large, rough hands flat on top of the cardboard cover, fixing me with a cold, piercing stare. I warned you last night, Richard Mitchell said, his raspy voice barely rising above the low hum of the old diner refrigerator. I told you that once I started pulling the threads, the whole thing would unravel. I have been running digital sweeps on your son and your daughter-in-law since you hung up the phone. I pulled their tax records, banking histories, employment files, and credit reports. I need to ask you one final time before I open this folder. Are you absolutely prepared to see the monster you raised? I did not blink. I did not look away. I simply nodded once, my jaw clamped tight. Open the folder, I commanded softly. Mitchell flipped the cover back, revealing a stack of heavily redacted corporate documents and printed digital spreadsheets. He tapped his thick index finger against the top page. Your son Derek is a highly skilled liar, Richard. He has been systematically lying to you, to his friends, and to the federal government for a very long time. Let us start with his prestigious career. He is not a senior commercial real estate broker. In fact, he does not even have a job. I stared at the paper, a cold numbness spreading rapidly through my chest. What do you mean he does not have a job? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. He told me just last week that the market was freezing up, but he was still closing deals. Mitchell let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He is not closing anything. He was officially terminated from his brokerage firm exactly 6 months ago. They fired him, Richard, and they stripped him of his professional license. I leaned closer to the table, my eyes scanning the dense legal text on the termination notice Mitchell had somehow managed to procure. Why was he fired? I demanded, though a sickening, intuitive part of my brain already knew the answer was going to be devastating. He was fired for gross financial misconduct, Mitchell replied flatly, taking a slow sip of the black coffee the waitress had just silently dropped on our table. Derek was caught embezzling money directly from client escrow accounts. He was quietly skimming off the top of massive commercial property deposits to fund his own personal lifestyle. His firm caught the discrepancies during a routine quarterly audit. They fired him immediately. The only reason he is not currently sitting in a federal holding cell is because the firm wanted to avoid a massive public relations scandal. They allowed him to quietly resign and sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for not pressing formal criminal charges. But he is completely blacklisted in the industry. He will never legally sell another piece of property in the state of Illinois again. The heavy weight of the revelation pressed down on my shoulders, threatening to crush the breath right out of my lungs. My son was not just a struggling businessman. He was a common thief. He was a white-collar criminal who had betrayed the fundamental trust of his clients. And that brand-new, sleek black car he drove to your house, Mitchell continued relentlessly dropping another massive load of reality onto the table. That beautiful German engineering he was so incredibly proud to show off. It is a lease, and according to the private financial databases I accessed this morning, he is exactly 3 months behind on the payments. The leasing company has already issued a formal repossession order, Mitchell said, sliding a second document across the table. A tow truck driver is probably out scouring the city looking for that vehicle right now. They have absolutely zero incoming revenue. Richard and their expenses are astronomical. Their credit cards are maxed out, their savings accounts are overdrawn, and they are living entirely on borrowed time. Everything you see, the designer clothes, the lavish dinners, the arrogant attitude, it is all a completely hollow facade. It is a fragile paper house built directly in the middle of a raging hurricane, and the wind is already tearing the roof off. I sat back against the cracked vinyl booth, slowly processing the staggering magnitude of the deception unfolding in front of me. The puzzle pieces were finally snapping together, forming a picture so profoundly ugly I could barely stand to look at it. This was exactly why they needed my house. This was exactly why they desperately needed to seize total control of my retirement funds and lock my wife safely away. They were completely desperate, drowning rapidly in a massive ocean of their own terrible financial decisions and criminal mistakes. They viewed my lifelong savings as their only remaining lifeline, and they were perfectly willing to drown me and Diane to keep themselves afloat. They honestly thought they could easily manipulate the old trusting father. I looked across the table at Mitchell, studying his weathered features. His cold eyes were watching me very carefully, waiting to see if I would finally break under the immense emotional pressure of knowing my only child was a sociopath. I did not break. The structural integrity of my resolve had never been stronger. I reached across the table and pulled the manila folder toward my chest. "This is a very good start, Mitchell," I said, my voice as cold and hard as reinforced steel. "But I really need to know exactly how deep this hole actually goes." Mitchell finished his coffee and slid the folder into his briefcase. He would continue to monitor their accounts and track the shadow lenders. I left the diner with a burning objective. Digital records were powerful, but they were not enough to expose the physical reality of their malice. I needed to see what my son hid in his home. I needed tangible proof. Opportunity presented itself 2 days later through misdelivered mail. The postal worker accidentally left envelopes addressed to Derek in my mailbox. Usually I would drop them at the post office. Today, they were my golden ticket inside his fortress. I drove my truck to their upscale neighborhood in Lincoln Park. The streets were lined with manicured trees and luxury vehicles. It was a neighborhood that was designed to project wealth and immense success, perfectly reflecting the hollow and entirely fabricated lives they had built for themselves over the last few miserable and highly destructive long, empty years. I parked down the street and walked up their driveway. The house was a modern monstrosity of glass and steel that looked more like a museum than a home. I rang the doorbell. It took 3 minutes for Stephanie to open the heavy door. She wore silk loungewear and held a glass of white wine even though it was barely noon on a Tuesday. She looked annoyed to see me. "Hello, Stephanie," I said, keeping my voice mild and holding up the letters. "The post office mixed up our mail again. I figured I would run it over since I was out." She sighed heavily, snatching the envelopes from my hand without a word of thanks. "Derek is not home," she said flatly. "He is out showing a commercial property to a foreign investor today." I knew that was a lie. Derek was unemployed and blacklisted, likely hiding from his violent creditors. But I simply nodded. Just as she was about to close the door, a delivery truck pulled into the driveway. A driver hopped out carrying 2 large designer clothing boxes. Stephanie's eyes lit up with greedy excitement. She pushed the door open wider and stepped onto the porch to sign for the packages. This was my narrow window of opportunity. I placed my hand on my stomach and let out a sharp groan of physical distress. "Stephanie." I gasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "My stomach is in absolute knots. I think I ate something terrible. Do you mind if I quickly use the guest bathroom on the main floor?" She looked at me with pure disgust. "Just make it quick," she muttered. "The guest bathroom is closed for remodeling," she continued. "Use the one attached to Derek's home office down the hall. Just do not touch any of his important work files." I thanked her profusely and hurried inside, clutching my stomach until I was out of sight. I walked briskly down the echoing hallway with its expensive hardwood floors. I slipped into Derek's home office and quietly clicked the door shut behind me, immediately dropping the sick old man act. I stood up perfectly straight, my eyes sweeping the room with cold precision. The office was a complete masterpiece of deception. The heavy mahogany desk was meticulously organized. There were framed certificates on the walls and thick leather-bound books. It was the immaculate workspace of a successful broker, completely disconnected from the miserable reality of his ruined career. I walked around the desk. I cared about what was hidden away. I grabbed the brass handle of the bottom right desk drawer and pulled. It was locked. It was not a heavy commercial safe like the one buried in my floor. It was a cheap cam lock designed to keep housekeepers away, not a determined structural engineer. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small flat metal tension wrench and a standard steel lockpick. Manipulating a cheap desk lock took seconds. After decades of navigating complicated construction sites, it was effortless. I applied gentle pressure to the cylinder, felt the internal pins click softly into place, and turned the wrench. The lock disengaged with a dull snap. I pulled the heavy wooden drawer open. It was not filled with financial documents. It contained only a single glossy pamphlet resting on top of a thick manila folder. I picked up the pamphlet. The paper felt cold. The front cover featured a highly edited photograph of a generic white building surrounded by dying pine trees. The bold text across the top read, "Shady Pines Assisted Living and Memory Care Facility." I opened the brochure, rapidly scanning the dense promotional text. I was looking for the location and state funding details. The facility was located in a desolate, economically depressed rural county exactly 300 miles away from Chicago. It was an entirely state-funded institution. It was the kind of place that operated on the absolute minimum budget legally allowed. But the location was only the beginning of the nightmare. I recognized the name Shady Pines from a local investigative journalism report I had read several years ago. It was a notoriously understaffed, aggressively abusive facility. The report had detailed horrific accounts of elderly patients being locked in their rooms for days and left entirely neglected. It was a dumping ground for the forgotten, a grim holding pen for people whose families wanted them to completely disappear. The cold, mechanical part of my brain suddenly froze. The raw, devastating reality of their plan finally hit me with the full, crushing weight of a collapsing concrete pillar. They were not just trying to steal the equity from my house. They were not just trying to shield their own assets from their dangerous shadow lenders and debt collectors. They were actively planning to throw my beautiful, gentle wife into a living hell. They were going to legally force her into a notoriously abusive asylum 300 miles away simply to ensure she would never be able to contact anyone or interfere with their lavish, stolen lifestyle. They were sentencing her to a miserable, lonely death surrounded by strangers. A surge of pure hatred flooded my veins, permanently burning away any remaining paternal hesitation. I pulled the cheap prepaid cellular phone from my pocket. I carefully flattened the glossy brochure against the mahogany desk and snapped several high-resolution photographs of every single page. I made sure the lighting was perfect, ensuring the text was entirely legible. I then opened the thick manila folder underneath it. It contained the finalized, heavily notarized medical transfer paperwork with Diane's full name already typed aggressively at the top. I meticulously photographed every single page of that deeply disturbing legal document. I placed the documents exactly as I had found them, slid the drawer shut, and used the wrench to re-engage the lock. I stepped into the attached bathroom, flushed the toilet to maintain my ruse, and washed my hands. I stared at my reflection. I was an executioner now. I dried my hands, stepped out of the office, and walked down the hallway just as Stephanie finished signing. I thanked her politely, walked out to my truck, and prepared to strike. I drove away from that massive glass and steel house in Lincoln Park, with my hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. The cold, hard plastic of the prepaid cellular phone rested heavily in my chest pocket. I did not drive straight home. I pulled into an empty park and killed the engine. The heavy silence was suddenly shattered by the ringing of my burner phone. It was Mitchell. "Mitchell," I answered, my voice sounding hollow. "I just left his house. They are planning to send Diane to Shady Pines." "I know about Shady Pines, Richard," Mitchell replied grimly. "But whatever you found in that desk drawer is only a small fraction of the actual nightmare. I told you I was going to follow the money, and I just hit the absolute bottom of the well. The structural damage is catastrophic." "Tell me," I demanded. "I finally tracked down the source of the threatening text messages you saw on his phone," Mitchell explained. "Derek did not just borrow money to cover a few missed mortgage payments. He is currently exactly $600,000 in debt. He owes this sum to a ruthless syndicate of shadow lenders. These highly dangerous individuals do not send letters. They break bones and make people disappear. $600,000. My son had managed to dig a hole so unimaginably deep that he was dragging our entire family down into the suffocating darkness. He had gambled with his career, lost everything, and turned to criminals. He promised them a massive payout by the end of this month," Mitchell continued. He used the estimated equity of your home and your retirement accounts as direct collateral. He convinced these criminals that he had absolute legal control over your entire estate. He does not have control, I countered. The power of attorney document he made me sign is flawed. I deliberately misspelled my name. Any judge will throw it out. Derek already knows that, Richard, Mitchell said softly. His lawyers found your deliberate mistakes. They know the current power of attorney is completely useless. A sudden spike of adrenaline pierced through my chest. Then why are they still pushing the medical transfer paperwork for Diane? How are they planning to seize the house? Because they completely changed their strategy, Mitchell explained. While you were looking in his desk drawer, I checked the sealed dockets in the family court system. Yesterday morning, Derek and Stephanie filed an immediate emergency ex parte motion. They are petitioning a judge to have you declared legally and permanently mentally incompetent, and to have Diane declared entirely medically unfit. I stopped breathing. The air in the truck cab suddenly felt freezing cold. They were attempting to strip away my fundamental human rights. They submitted a heavily fabricated narrative, Mitchell continued. They claimed that your cognitive abilities have rapidly declined. They stated that you are suffering from unmanageable dementia, that you are a physical danger, and that you are neglecting Diane. They are asking the judge to grant them absolute emergency guardianship. If the judge signs that order, they will not need your signature to sell the house. They will have the power of the state backing them. A judge will never grant that motion without absolute proof, I argued. I can pass any psychological evaluation. They do not need a long medical history if they have a highly documented violent incident, Mitchell warned. Judges in emergency family court hearings rely heavily on official police reports. Derek needs you to look completely out of control in a public setting. He needs to physically demonstrate to the court that you are an active threat. How? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. They are setting a trap, Mitchell replied. I intercepted an email exchange between Stephanie and their attorney. They are planning to take you and Diane out for a very lavish dinner soon. They intend to order expensive alcohol and ensure that you consume a significant amount of it. Once you are intoxicated, they are going to deliberately provoke you. They are going to insult you, push your emotional buttons, and do everything in their power to make you lose your temper completely. Their goal is to make you shout, throw something, or ideally become physically aggressive in the middle of a crowded restaurant. Once you react, Mitchell concluded, Stephanie will immediately call the police. She will play the terrified daughter-in-law. The police will arrive, see an aggressive older man causing a massive disturbance, and they will arrest you. That police report will be fast-tracked directly to the judge the very next morning. It will be the final piece of undeniable proof they need to officially declare you mentally incompetent and seize absolutely everything you own. I sat in the silent truck. The sheer malice of their strategy was breathtaking. My own flesh and blood had systematically designed a psychological bear trap. They wanted to humiliate me publicly, strip me of my dignity, and use my natural reaction to their cruelty as the very weapon that would permanently destroy my life. They believed I was nothing more than an emotional, predictable old man who could be easily manipulated. They thought I would blindly walk into a dining room and explode right on cue. Richard, Mitchell's voice broke through the silence. Are you still there? I heard you, Mitchell, I replied, my voice completely devoid of panic. The burning rage had rapidly cooled, hardening into a solid block of pure ice. When is this dinner supposed to take place? I do not have an exact date yet, Mitchell answered. But given the rapidly approaching deadline from the shadow lenders, it has to be soon. The creditors want their $600,000 by the end of the month. Derek has to trigger this public incident within the next few days to get the court order signed. You need to be extremely careful, Richard. Do not accept any invitations. We need to figure out a defensive legal strategy immediately. No, I said softly, staring fiercely at my own cold reflection in the rearview mirror. We are not going to play defense, Mitchell. I am tired of waiting for thou to strike the foundation of my home. If they want a public incident to prove their case, I am going to give them one. But it is not going to end with me in the back of a police cruiser. Richard, do not do anything reckless, Mitchell warned. If you miscalculate even slightly, they win. I spent 40 years calculating structural stress points, Mitchell, I reminded him quietly. I know exactly how much pressure a beam can take before it violently snaps. I want you to find out exactly who holds that $600,000 debt. I want the names of the creditors and their current account routing numbers. Just get the information ready for me by tomorrow morning. I ended the call. I lowered the burner phone and placed it carefully onto the passenger seat. I turned the ignition key, and the heavy engine of my truck roared to life. I shifted into gear and pulled slowly out of the empty park. The plan was terrifyingly simple. They wanted to get me drunk at an upcoming dinner, provoke an aggressive outburst, call the police, and use the official arrest report as undeniable proof of my sudden dementia. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the basic laws of physics. When you apply massive crushing pressure to a solid steel foundation, it does not just quietly fold. It violently rebounds, completely destroying everything in its immediate path. I drove back to my suburban home feeling a profound sense of clarity. The storm of betrayal had passed, leaving behind a cold landscape where my paternal affection used to reside. I parked the truck in the driveway and walked through the front door, slipping off my boots. Diane was sitting in the living room watching a movie on the television. I smiled at her, a genuine smile this time, filled with a silent promise that she would never spend a single second of her life in a place like Shady Pines. I walked into my back study, closed the heavy oak door, and sat down at my desk. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my regular smartphone, not the burner phone I used to contact Mitchell. It was time to initiate the collapse. It was time to feed the starving wolves exactly what they craved. I took a deep breath, relaxing my posture, letting my shoulders slump slightly. I closed my eyes and practiced the tone of my voice. I needed to sound older, slightly overwhelmed by complex financial matters, but bubbling with a foolish, naive excitement. I needed to play the exact character they had designed for me in their cruel family court petition. I dialed Derek's number. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. He answered with a clipped tone, likely assuming I was calling to bother him with some trivial household problem. "Hello, Dad," he said, sounding inherently annoyed. "I am actually really busy right now with a client. Can this wait until the weekend?" I let out a warm chuckle, perfectly masking the disgust I felt hearing his voice. "I am so sorry to interrupt your busy schedule, son," I replied, pitching my voice slightly higher to sound breathless. "But I just received some incredible news from the bank, and I really needed to share it with you immediately. You are the financial expert in the family after all, and I really need your professional advice on how to handle this situation." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The word expert always stroked his massive ego. "What is going on, Dad?" he asked, his tone softening just a fraction, the annoyance replaced by a glimmer of curiosity. Well, I began speaking slowly, mimicking the pace of a man struggling to grasp modern banking concepts. "You know how your mother and I have always lived very frugally. We never took expensive vacations or bought luxury cars. I always told you I was putting a little bit away for a rainy day. Well, I completely forgot about a specific high-yield certificate of deposit. I opened a very long time ago. The bank just called to notify me that it officially matured this morning." I paused, letting the silence stretch for a perfectly calculated 3 seconds. "Okay," Derek said cautiously. "How much are we talking about here?" "It is $1.5 million, I said brightly. I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath over the phone speaker. Then absolute dead silence. I could vividly imagine him sitting in his fake home office, his eyes widening in pure shock, his greedy mind rapidly calculating how many violent debts that amount of cash could instantly erase. $1.5 million was not just a life raft for him. It was a luxury yacht that could carry him far away from the criminal syndicate he owed. "Dad." Derek finally stammered, his voice cracking slightly. Are you serious? 1.5 million. Are you absolutely sure the bank did not make a clerical error? I am absolutely positive, I replied cheerfully. They sent over all the official documentation. But here is the problem, son. I remembered what you said a few weeks ago about those brutal new estate tax laws in Illinois. If I just dump this massive amount of cash into my regular checking account, the government is going to tax me to death, right? I do not want to give all my hard-earned savings to the state. Yes, Derek said quickly, his words tumbling over each other in his sudden desperation. Yes, absolutely. You cannot just leave that kind of capital sitting exposed. The tax liabilities would be absolutely catastrophic for you and Mom. That is exactly what I was worried about. I sighed heavily. So I was thinking about your brilliant advice regarding the protected trusts. But honestly, all that legal paperwork you brought over gave me a terrible headache. It is just too complicated for an old man like me to fully understand. So I came up with a much simpler idea, and I want to know what you think. What is your idea, Dad? He asked, trying very hard to sound calm and measured, though I could clearly hear the frantic greed vibrating in his throat. I was thinking we could just open a new joint savings account, I said, casually dropping the ultimate bait directly into the trap. An account with both of our names on it. I will simply transfer the entire $1.5 million directly into that joint account. That way, if anything ever happens to me or your mother, the money is already legally yours. It bypasses the probate court entirely, and you can easily manage the funds for us without needing any complicated power of attorney documents. Does that sound like a solid financial strategy to you? Derek did not answer immediately. He was likely biting his fist to keep from screaming in pure joy. This was his absolute dream scenario. A joint account meant he would have immediate, unrestricted legal access to every single penny the moment the transfer cleared. Dad, that is actually a brilliant idea, Derek finally said, his voice dripping with forced sincerity and artificial affection. I am honestly really proud of you for thinking of this. We should definitely set this up as soon as possible. Wonderful, I said, smiling coldly at the wall of my study. I will contact the bank tomorrow morning and start the preliminary transfer paperwork. Take your time, Dad, Derek replied smoothly, though the desperation was still clearly audible. Let me know the second you need me to go to the bank with you. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. Lied effortlessly, matching his deceit word for word. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the desk. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed on the wooden desk. It was an incoming text message from Stephanie. I opened the message. Hi, Richard, the text read. Derek just told me your amazing news. We want to celebrate this wonderful blessing properly. We are taking you both out for a very special Mother's Day dinner this Friday night. I already made reservations at the Obsidian Prime downtown. Do not even think about arguing, it is entirely our treat. I read the message twice, letting the audacity of her words sink in. They were completely broke, yet they booked a $1,000 dinner just to spring their psychological trap. They had no idea that I was already holding the detonator. I stared at the glowing screen of my smartphone, reading Stephanie's text message over and over again. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of her words practically radiated from the digital text. They were completely broke, heavily pursued by violent creditors, and facing total financial ruin, yet they had just casually booked a table at one of the most exclusive and expensive steakhouses in downtown Chicago. They were fully prepared to spend money they absolutely did not possess solely to orchestrate a public stage for my psychological destruction. They needed an audience for my supposed mental breakdown, and they were willing to put it on a credit card to make it happen. I did not reply to her message. I simply locked the screen and set the phone face down on the heavy oak desk. The bait had been successfully taken, and the trap they thought they were setting for me was now the exact location of their own impending execution. I picked up the cheap gray burner phone and dialed Mitchell's number. He answered on the first ring, a testament to his nocturnal efficiency. We have a location and a timeline, I said, keeping my voice low and methodical. The event is going to take place this Friday evening at the Obsidian Prime. That gives us exactly 3 days to completely finalize the structural shift in power. Have you located the individuals who hold Derek's massive debt? Yes, Mitchell replied, his raspy voice crackling slightly over the cheap cellular connection. I have identified the primary creditor. It is a highly organized, completely ruthless private lending syndicate operating out of the South Side. They specialize in high-interest short-term bridge loans for desperate commercial developers. They hold all the legally binding promissory notes your son signed. They are violent men, Richard, but they are also businessmen. They prefer clean cash over messy physical altercations if the profit margin is right. Perfect, I replied smoothly, feeling a cold wave of absolute certainty wash over my mind. I do not just want to pay off his debt to save him, Mitchell. That would be a complete waste of capital. I want to entirely consume the debt. I want to legally purchase the promissory notes and the collateral agreements. I want to become the undisputed sole owner of his financial obligations. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Mitchell slowly exhaling a cloud of cigarette smoke. That is an incredibly aggressive maneuver, Richard Mitchell finally said, a note of genuine professional respect coloring his gritty tone. If you purchase the debt directly, you legally step into the shoes of the syndicate. You become his absolute master. You can immediately call the loan freeze his remaining assets and legally foreclose on the property he used as collateral. You can completely destroy him without ever throwing a single physical punch. That is precisely the architecture of the plan I confirmed. But I cannot do it under my own name. If he discovers I am the creditor before Friday night, the psychological impact is completely compromised. I need you to establish a ghost corporation, a blind limited liability company with a registered agent that completely obscures my identity. Can you build that structure in 24 hours? Give me 12, Mitchell replied confidently. I will set up a holding company in Delaware by tomorrow morning. We will call it Apex Structural Recovery. But buying high-risk paper from a shadow syndicate is not going to be cheap. They will want a premium to walk away from a target they have already bled. The money is not an issue, I stated firmly. The $1.5 million certificate of deposit I mentioned to Derek on the phone was not a fabrication. I had spent 40 years quietly diverting a significant portion of my engineering salary into highly aggressive compound interest accounts. Diane and I lived entirely on my standard pension, allowing that massive secondary fund to grow silently in the dark. It was meant to be a generational safety net, a beautiful financial legacy to ensure my son and his future children would never know the bitter taste of poverty. It was a profound tragedy that I was now forced to use that exact same money to purchase his absolute ruin. Withdraw $800,000 in certified bank drafts first thing tomorrow morning, Mitchell instructed. We are going to offer the syndicate a substantial premium. We will pay them $700,000 for the $600,000 debt. That extra $100,000 is the precise cost of buying their total silence and securing the original physical legal documents with your son's signature in wet ink. The following morning, the Chicago sky was a brilliant, deceptive blue. I drove to my primary financial institution and sat in the plush, quiet office of my personal wealth manager. I signed the heavy stacks of withdrawal paperwork with a perfectly steady hand, transferring the massive sum into the newly minted, completely untraceable accounts of Apex Structural Recovery. By noon, I was sitting in the dimly lit back room of a private cigar lounge on the South Side, a neutral territory arranged by Mitchell. Across the heavy mahogany table sat 2 men in expensive, poorly tailored suits. They possessed the cold, dead eyes of men who calculated human life in strict dollar amounts. Mitchell sat beside me, acting as the highly skilled intermediary, speaking their specific language of margins, risk assessment, and immediate liquidity. I did not speak a single word during the negotiation. I simply watched as Mitchell slid the heavy leather briefcase containing the certified bank drafts across the polished wood. The men inspected these drafts with meticulous care, their greedy eyes verifying the massive transfer of wealth. Once they were completely satisfied, the man sitting on the left reached into his own leather satchel and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He slid it across the table toward Mitchell. "It is all there," the man said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "The original promissory notes, the signed collateral agreements targeting his residential property, and the personal guarantees he foolishly signed away. The paper is officially transferred to your holding company. He is your problem now. Tell your client we appreciate the clean business." The two men stood up, buttoned their suits, and walked out of the lounge, leaving the heavy envelope resting on the table between Mitchell and me. Mitchell did not touch the envelope. He simply nodded toward it, signaling that the transaction was complete and the weapon was fully loaded. I reached out and pulled the thick package toward my chest. I opened the metal clasp and slid the crisp white papers out onto the table. There at the bottom of the dense legal text detailing astronomical interest rates and immediate foreclosure rights was my son's signature. The ink was dark blue, the strokes frantic and sloppy, betraying the absolute desperation he must have felt the day he signed his life away to criminals. He had willingly mortgaged his future, his dignity, and his family's security, all to maintain a hollow, pathetic illusion of wealth for a woman who despised him. As I stared at his signature, a profound, chilling transformation finalized within my soul. I was no longer the loving father, desperately trying to understand where he had failed his only child. I was no longer the heartbroken old man hiding in the hallway of his own home. I was now the sole proprietor of Apex Structural Recovery. I was the absolute legal owner of Derek's massive crushing debt. With a single phone call, I could legally seize his home, empty whatever meager bank accounts he had left, and force him into a devastating, inescapable bankruptcy. I held the absolute power of total financial annihilation directly in my hands, and the weight of it felt incredibly satisfying. I carefully placed the documents back into the envelope and locked it inside my briefcase. "We have the leverage," I said to Mitchell, standing up from the heavy leather chair. "Now we prepare the demolition site. Friday night, at the Obsidian Prime. We let them build their little stage. We let them attempt their pathetic psychological trap, and then we bring the entire building down directly on their heads." The 24 hours following the purchase of my son's massive debt passed in a state of absolute unnatural calm. I spent the entire day Thursday sitting in my quiet study, meticulously reviewing every single page of the original promissory notes I had acquired from the Shadow Syndicate. I studied the aggressive interest rates, the draconian penalty clauses, and the absolute forfeiture of all collateral assets. I traced my finger over Derek's hurried, desperate signature again and again. I was no longer merely a disappointed father preparing to defend himself in family court. I was the architect of his absolute financial ruin, holding the legal blueprints securely in my own hands. I had successfully secured my home, protected my retirement savings, and built an impenetrable wall around Diane. I mistakenly believed the investigation was entirely complete. I thought I knew the absolute worst of their sins. But evil, much like rot in a wooden foundation, always spreads much further and much deeper than you initially suspect. Late Thursday afternoon, as the setting sun cast long, dark shadows across the worn floorboards of my study, the cheap prepaid cellular phone resting on my desk began to vibrate. The sudden, harsh buzzing shattered the silence of the house. I picked it up immediately, recognizing Mitchell's unlisted number on the small digital screen. I answered the call, fully expecting him to confirm the final logistical details regarding the transfer of the corporate holding documents for Apex Structural Recovery. Richard Mitchell said, his raspy voice sounding noticeably different. There was a heavy, grim tension in his tone that had not been there yesterday at the cigar lounge. "I have spent the last 12 hours running a secondary deep diagnostic sweep on Stephanie's personal finances. You hired me to look at the entire structure, and I found a massive anomaly that did not make any logical sense based on the data we already gathered. "What did you find?" I asked, leaning forward in my heavy leather chair. I felt a sudden familiar tightening in my chest. We knew Derek was completely broke and drowning in debt. Mitchell continued, his words slow and incredibly precise. We knew his firm fired him 6 months ago, and we knew the luxury vehicle he drives is currently facing an active repossession order. Yet despite their absolute lack of any legitimate income, Stephanie has continued to aggressively fund an incredibly lavish, high-end lifestyle. She is still buying expensive designer handbags, booking expensive restaurant reservations, and purchasing luxury imported clothing on a weekly basis. I needed to know exactly where that specific river of money was coming from, because it was not coming from the Shadow Syndicate. The syndicate gave Derek money to pay off his immediate commercial real estate debts, not to buy his wife jewelry. "So how is she paying for it?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low whisper. "She is paying for it using a highly exclusive black-tier credit card," Mitchell explained. "It is a credit instrument issued only to individuals with pristine, flawless credit histories and substantial, verifiable liquid assets. It is the kind of card that has virtually no spending limit." But there is a massive problem, Richard. Stephanie does not have a pristine credit history. Her personal credit score was completely destroyed 3 years ago when a boutique design business she tried to start went bankrupt. Derek's credit is equally ruined. Neither of them could possibly qualify for a basic entry-level credit card at a local bank, let alone a top-tier luxury instrument. I stared blankly at the wall, my mind rapidly trying to process the financial impossibility. "Then how did she manage to open the account?" I demanded. Mitchell paused. I could hear the faint sound of him shifting papers on his desk. "She opened the account 6 months ago, Richard. Right around the exact same time Derek was fired for embezzling client funds. She applied for the exclusive credit card entirely online. But she did not use her own name, and she absolutely did not use her own identifying information. She used a different identity. She used the identity of someone who has a completely flawless, untouched credit history spanning over 40 years. The cold, heavy block of ice in my chest suddenly shattered, sending sharp, jagged shards of pure adrenaline directly into my bloodstream. My breathing stopped completely. Richard, Mitchell said, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute, profound disgust. "She used Diane's social security number." The words hung in this quiet air of my study, echoing off the towering shelves of engineering manuals and family photographs. The sheer, unfathomable cruelty of the revelation was physically paralyzing. I could not speak. I could not move. "Stephanie stole your wife's identity," Mitchell continued, relentlessly outlining the catastrophic damage. "She used Diane's clean name, her pristine credit rating, and her personal federal identification numbers to secure a massive line of unsecured credit. For the past 6 months, Stephanie has been actively, aggressively destroying the credit profile of a paralyzed 68-year-old woman. Every single expensive dinner, every designer handbag, every piece of jewelry she flaunted was purchased by fraudulently exploiting the identity of the very woman she constantly mocked and verbally abused. She treated Diane like a worthless burden to her face while secretly using her as a personal, limitless bank account in the shadows. The anger that washed over me in that specific moment was entirely different from anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was not the hot, burning rage I felt when I heard Stephanie threaten Diane in the kitchen. It was not the cold, calculating anger I felt when I discovered Derek's plot to have me declared mentally incompetent. This was a silent, absolute, terrifying fury. It was the kind of total emotional devastation that completely hollows out a man's soul, leaving behind nothing but a dark, endless void of pure vengeance. How much I managed to ask. The 2 words felt like broken glass scraping against my throat. "She has racked up over $80,000 in fraudulent charges in just 6 months, Mitchell answered grimly. "The credit card company has already flagged the account for severe delinquency. The collections department has been trying to send warning notices, but Stephanie cleverly diverted all the physical mail associated with the account to a private post office box downtown. Diane's perfect credit score is currently in absolute ruins, Richard. If this was left undiscovered for another month, federal agencies would have started seizing Diane's personal medical funds to satisfy the massive debt. I slowly closed my eyes, picturing Diane sitting in the living room, completely oblivious to the horrific financial crimes being committed against her in the dark. This changes the entire legal landscape, Richard Mitchell stated firmly, pulling me back to the cold reality of the situation. We are no longer just dealing with a civil family court issue or a private debt purchase. What Stephanie has done is a massive, undeniable federal crime. It is severe premeditated identity theft and federal wire fraud. Because she specifically targeted an elderly disabled individual, the federal sentencing guidelines carry mandatory minimums. If we turn this evidence over to the authorities, this is not a fine or a slap on the wrist. She is looking at a minimum of 5 to 7 years in a federal penitentiary. I want all of it, I commanded, my voice completely devoid of any human hesitation. I want every single digital footprint she left. I want the original application, the diverted mailing address, the itemized lists of every fraudulent purchase she made, and the active federal fraud statutes. I want you to print every single document and place it securely inside a heavy leather folder. Bring it to me immediately. I will have the entire dossier compiled and delivered to your house by tomorrow morning, Mitchell promised. You now have the power to destroy Derek financially, and the power to destroy Stephanie criminally. What exactly are you going to do, Richard? I am going to take my family out for a nice dinner, I replied softly. I hung up the phone. Friday evening arrived with a quiet, somber grace. The setting sun painted the Chicago sky in brilliant shades of bruised purple and deep crimson. I stood in front of the tall mirror in our bedroom, buttoning the crisp white shirt of my finest tailored charcoal suit. It was the exact same suit I used to wear when presenting massive multi-million-dollar structural designs to ruthless city planning boards. It was not just clothing. It was the physical armor of a chief engineer preparing to step onto a highly volatile demolition site. I adjusted my silk tie, making sure the knot was absolutely perfect. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the leather folder I had carefully tucked inside my leather briefcase. I walked into the living room. Diane was waiting for me. I had hired a professional stylist to come to the house earlier that afternoon to do her hair and makeup. She was wearing a beautiful, elegant navy blue dress that perfectly complemented her silver hair. Despite the physical limitations of her stroke, she looked incredibly dignified, radiating a quiet, enduring strength that commanded absolute respect. I walked over to her wheelchair, leaning down to gently kiss her soft cheek. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and mild apprehension about spending an entire evening with Derek and Stephanie. She had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. She had no idea that tonight, the heavy, suffocating burden they had placed on our family was going to be violently lifted forever. I gripped the rubber handles of her wheelchair, securely, feeling a profound sense of protective power surge through my hands. I looked down at her and offered a warm, reassuring smile. "Let's go have a nice steak, honey," I said. The echo of my own reassuring words to Diane faded into the background as the harsh reality of the present moment snapped sharply back into focus. We were no longer standing in the quiet safety of our suburban hallway. We were sitting at the heavy oak table inside the Obsidian Prime. Stephanie's cruel, arrogant declaration that they were absolutely not paying for my wife's dinner still hung heavily in the air above us. It was a vile statement that perfectly encapsulated everything rotten inside her soul. Across the table, Derek slowly chewed his expensive steak, a sickening smirk now forming. His smirk was the expression of a man who firmly believed he was holding every single winning card in the deck. He looked at me with a patronizing mixture of pity and superiority, completely convinced that I was just a senile, defeated old man entirely at his mercy. He thought his vicious family court petition was quietly working its way through the legal system. He thought the massive joint bank account containing my life savings would be fully operational by Monday morning. He was sitting there celebrating his impending wealth, blind to the massive wrecking ball swinging directly toward him, or Antoine. The young, nervous waiter was still standing awkwardly near the edge of our table, his pen hovering uncertainly over his small black notepad. He looked absolutely miserable, trapped in the highly uncomfortable crossfire of a bitter family dispute. He clearly wanted nothing more than to quickly run the credit cards and escape the suffocating tension radiating from our booth. I looked at the young man, noting the exhaustion in his eyes. He was just trying to earn an honest living, a concept my son and his wife had now completely abandoned in favor of fraud, theft, and absolute moral bankruptcy. Stephanie let out an exaggerated dramatic sigh, making sure everyone at the adjacent tables could hear her profound irritation. She reached into her expensive designer handbag, the very same handbag she had fraudulently purchased using my wife's stolen identity. She pulled out a sleek imported leather wallet and flipped it open with a sharp snap of her wrist. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers slide into the tight leather pockets. She was preparing to retrieve the black tier credit card, the physical instrument of her federal crime, completely unaware that the trap had already been securely locked around her ankles. Beside me, Diane shifted uncomfortably in her wheelchair. She kept her eyes focused strictly on the white linen tablecloth, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. I reached out gently beneath the table and rested my hand firmly over her trembling fingers. I gave her a slow, reassuring squeeze, silently communicating that the time for fear was officially over. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cold, analytical mindset of the chief structural engineer fully taking command of my entire central nervous system. It was finally time to execute the controlled demolition of their stolen lives. I turned my attention back to the young waiter. He shifted his weight, looking at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "You can step away now, son," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and remarkably even. "There is absolutely no need for you to split this bill or run any payments right now. We are going to need a few more minutes to conclude our private family business." The waiter blinked in surprise, but the profound relief washing over his face was immediate. He offered a quick, deeply appreciative nod, stepped backward, and rapidly disappeared into the crowded dining room. Stephanie immediately dropped her sleek leather wallet onto the table with a loud, aggressive thud. Her eyes narrowed into angry, venomous slits. "What are you doing?" she hissed, leaning forcefully across the table, her voice dropping into a sharp, threatening whisper. "I just told the waiter exactly how we are handling this check. Why are you intentionally dragging this out and making a ridiculous public scene? You are completely embarrassing us. We have much better things to do tonight than sit here and wait for you to slowly count your pennies. Just let him run the separate tabs right now." Derek reached over and placed a restraining hand on his wife's forearm, playing the role of the reasonable peacemaker. "Just calm down, Stephanie," he murmured smoothly. "Let him have his little moment." He looked at me, a condescending smile playing on his lips. "Come on, Dad. Do not make this harder than it has to be. You know Mom barely touched her food. It just does not make any financial sense for us to subsidize a wasted meal. We are trying to be responsible here. Please let us just pay the bill and get you guys safely back home tonight." His hollow words of supposed financial responsibility were the absolute height of bitter irony. I did not bother to answer him. I did not even look at his deceitful face. Instead, I slowly raised my right hand, lifting 2 fingers slightly into the air. It was a subtle, highly specific gesture, completely unnoticeable to anyone who was not explicitly looking for it. I now directed my gaze across the dimly lit expanse of the restaurant, looking past the bustling waiters and the wealthy patrons. I looked directly toward the heavy mahogany host stand positioned near the grand front entrance doors. Standing perfectly still beside the host stand was a tall, impeccably dressed man. This was Vincent, the general manager of the Obsidian Prime. He was wearing a custom-tailored black suit that spoke of immense authority and absolute discretion. Mitchell had visited this exact restaurant earlier in the afternoon to have a very private, highly lucrative conversation with Vincent. Money had changed hands, specific instructions had been given, and the stage had been meticulously set. When I raised my hand, Vincent caught my eye immediately. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement and began moving directly toward us. Vincent moved through the crowded dining room with the smooth, silent grace of a predatory shark gliding through deep water. He effortlessly bypassed the other tables, his absolute focus locked entirely on our booth. Stephanie, noticing the shift in my attention, turned her head to follow my gaze. When she saw the general manager approaching our table, her angry expression instantly vanished, replaced by a bright, completely artificial smile. She immediately assumed he was coming over to offer a complimentary bottle of champagne or to apologize profusely for the waiter's supposed incompetence. Her staggering arrogance blinded her entirely to reality. As Vincent arrived at the edge of our table, the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away completely. He did not carry a standard black plastic checkbook. He did not hold a dessert menu or a wine list. Tucked securely under his left arm was a thick, heavy leather folder, the exact kind used by high-level corporate executives to carry highly sensitive, binding legal documents. He stopped directly next to Derek, his posture perfectly straight, his expression entirely devoid of any customer service warmth. The executioner had officially arrived, and he was holding all their devastating secrets. Vincent stood towering over our table, an imposing figure of silent, unyielding authority. The ambient chatter of the surrounding diners seemed to fade away, leaving our booth isolated in a tense vacuum. Stephanie, misreading the gravity of the situation and blinded by her own arrogance, let out a sharp scoff. She did not bother to look up at Vincent's face. Instead, she lazily picked up the metallic black credit card she had just pulled from her imported wallet. She held the card between her perfectly manicured fingers, extending her arm outward in a careless gesture dripping with contempt. She fully expected him to take the card, bow his head in apology, and scurry away to process her fraudulent payment without a word of protest. "It is about time management finally stepped in," Stephanie said, her voice deliberately loud enough to turn the heads of the wealthy patrons sitting at adjacent booths. "Your floor staff is incompetent. We have been sitting here waiting to pay for 10 minutes simply because your young waiter could not comprehend a basic request to split a standard dinner check. I want you to run this card for the 2 expensive meals and leave the old woman's salmon on a separate tab. And honestly, you should heavily discount our drinks for the inconvenience." She flicked her wrist impatiently, gesturing for Vincent to take the black metal card. But Vincent did not move a muscle. He did not reach out to accept the payment. He remained perfectly still, his posture rigid and formal, his eyes locked directly onto Stephanie's face with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. The silence that suddenly stretched across our table became incredibly suffocating. It was a heavy, thick silence pregnant with an impending disaster. Finally realizing that the card had not been taken, Stephanie slowly looked up, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. She lived her entire life treating working-class people like invisible servants, and this sudden defiance shattered her reality. She opened her mouth to snap another insult, but Vincent spoke first. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of the standard obsequious customer service tone she so desperately craved. He looked down at the credit card hovering in the air between them, and his upper lip curled into a microscopic expression of utter disgust. "I am sorry, ma'am," Vincent said quietly. The apology was a mere professional formality, a hollow word that carried absolutely no actual regret. "But I cannot process that payment instrument. Furthermore, no one in this establishment or any other establishment in this city will be able to process it tonight." Stephanie's arm remained frozen awkwardly in the air. A look of profound bewilderment washed over her heavily contoured features, slowly replacing the haughty anger. "Excuse me," she demanded, her voice losing its commanding edge and rising into a defensive squeak. "What exactly are you talking about right now? You clearly do not understand how these things work. This is a highly exclusive black-tier account. There is absolutely no preset spending limit on this card. Stop wasting my time and run the payment." Vincent did not blink. He slowly shook his head, his dark eyes burning with a cold, judgmental fire that made Stephanie physically recoil into the cushions of her leather chair. "The issue is not a spending limit, ma'am," Vincent replied, his voice carrying perfectly across the deadly silent table, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "The issue is that this specific card, along with all associated financial accounts, tied to the underlying Social Security numbers, was officially flagged and completely frozen by the Federal Fraud Department exactly 2 hours ago." The heavy words struck the oak table like a physical blow. Federal Fraud Department. The terrifying syllables hung in the cool air, echoing violently inside Stephanie's mind. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the table, watching with immense satisfaction as the arrogant blood completely drained from her face. Her skin turned a sickly ashen shade of pale gray, making the heavy makeup she wore look like a cheap mask on a corpse. Her hand, which had been holding the card with such supreme confidence just moments before, began to tremble uncontrollably. The heavy black metal slipped from her weak grasp, falling onto the pristine white tablecloth with a dull clatter. She knew. In that exact fraction of a second, looking at the cold, unyielding face of the restaurant manager, Stephanie knew with absolute certainty that her terrible secret was completely out. She knew that the luxurious fake life she had built entirely on the stolen identity of my paralyzed wife was instantly irreparably destroyed. The walls of her magnificent deception were crashing down around her, and there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. She opened her mouth, desperately gasping for air, like a fish pulled roughly from the water, but no words came out. Her throat worked silently. She looked frantically at me, and then down at Diane, her wide eyes reflecting a sudden terror. But Derek did not understand. My son, entirely consumed by his own massive financial stress, his impending deadlines with the Shadow Syndicate, and his desperate need to maintain absolute control over the evening, completely misinterpreted the situation unfolding in front of him. He did not know anything about the identity theft. He did not know that his wife had committed a massive federal crime. He only heard a restaurant manager publicly disrespecting his wife and loudly declining their payment in front of a room full of Chicago's elite. The public humiliation was simply too much for his fragile ego to handle. Derek slammed both of his palms down hard on the heavy oak table, causing the crystal wine glasses and silverware to rattle violently. "What the hell is your problem?" Derek snarled, his face flushing a deep crimson. He pushed his chair back with a loud screech against the polished wooden floor and tried to stand up, attempting to physically intimidate the stoic manager. "How dare you speak to my wife that way in front of these people? Do you have any idea who we are? I am a senior commercial real estate broker in this city. You take that damn card right now and run it again, or I swear to God I will have your job by tomorrow morning. I personally know the owners of this restaurant group. I will absolutely ruin your career." Derek was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he stood over the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at Vincent's face. He thought he was projecting strength. He thought he was defending his family's honor. He had absolutely no idea how pathetic and small he truly looked. He was a drowning man, screaming at the ocean, unaware that a massive tidal wave was already cresting right above his head. He demanded respect, clinging desperately to a fabricated title from a job that fired him in disgrace 6 months ago. Vincent did not flinch at the sudden outburst. He simply stood his ground, weathering Derek's storm of hollow threats with the calm patience of a man who held all the true power. Vincent did not flinch at the sudden outburst. He simply stood his ground, weathering Derek's storm of hollow threats with the calm patience of a man who held all the true power. When Derek finally ran out of breath, his chest heaving as he leaned aggressively over the pristine white tablecloth, Vincent slowly shifted his gaze away from the enraged younger man. He looked directly across the table at me. He offered a single, highly respectful nod, silently acknowledging that his part in this meticulously orchestrated performance was now entirely complete. "Thank you, Vincent," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tensions like a sharp steel blade. "That will be all for now. You have handled this uncomfortable situation with absolute professionalism, and I deeply appreciate your discretion." Vincent extended his left arm gracefully, placing the thick, heavy leather folder he had been carrying directly onto the center of our table right next to the discarded, useless black credit card. He took one step back, bowed his head slightly, and turned away, melting back into the shadows of the busy restaurant. He left Derek standing awkwardly, his finger still pointing at empty space, his hollow threats completely ignored by the man he had just tried to intimidate. Derek blinked in confusion, his furious momentum suddenly entirely derailed. He looked down at the heavy leather folder resting on the table, then looked up at me. The condescending smirk was completely gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. "What the hell is this, Dad?" he demanded, his voice trembling slightly with a sudden, unexplainable fear. "What is going on here? Why did that manager just drop a folder on our table and walk away without apologizing to my wife?" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet authority I commanded in that moment was absolute. I simply reached out with my right hand and placed my fingertips gently on the edge of the smooth leather cover. I slowly, deliberately slid the heavy folder across the polished oak table until it rested directly in front of my son. "Open it," I commanded softly. Derek stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive device. He slowly lowered himself back into his plush leather chair, his eyes darting nervously between my cold, unyielding face and the dark leather cover. Beside him, Stephanie had stopped complaining entirely. The terrifying mention of the federal fraud department was still actively short-circuiting her arrogant brain. She watched in absolute silence as Derek's trembling hands finally reached out and flipped the heavy leather cover open to reveal the documents inside. The first document sitting on top of the stack was a crisp official legal notice printed on heavy stock paper. It was the absolute undeniable proof of his complete financial annihilation. Derek stared at the bold black letters across the top of the page. His eyes scanned the dense legal text rapidly, his pupils dilating in pure, unadulterated horror, as his brain slowly processed the devastating reality of the words printed clearly before him. He recognized the name of the holding company instantly. I leaned forward, resting my forearms comfortably on the edge of the table. I looked directly into his panicked eyes, speaking with a terrifying calmness that chilled the very air around us. "I own your $600,000 debt, Derek," I stated evenly, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum destructive force. Derek gasped, a sharp, ragged sound tearing from his throat. He looked up at me, his face completely devoid of color, resembling a terrified ghost. "Apex Structural Recovery," he whispered, reading the name of the holding company printed on the assignment papers. You bought the debt from the syndicate. You are the one who purchased my loans. I bought every single piece of paper you signed," I confirmed, my voice entirely devoid of any paternal warmth or forgiveness. "I hold the original promissory notes. I hold the aggressive penalty clauses. And most importantly, I hold the direct collateral agreements you foolishly signed targeting your residential property in Lincoln Park. You thought you could use the equity of my home to save yourself from violent criminals. You thought you could strip away my life savings and lock your mother in a state-run asylum just to cover your own pathetic failures. You completely underestimated the foundation you were trying to destroy." Derek's mouth opened and closed silently, like a dying fish suffocating on dry land. He reached blindly for his water glass, his hands shaking so violently that the crystal tipped over, spilling ice and water across the white tablecloth, soaking into the fabric like tears. "As the sole undisputed legal owner of your massive financial obligations," I continued, my voice steady and completely merciless, "I exercised my immediate right to call the entire loan due. And because you are completely broke, unemployed, and entirely incapable of satisfying the massive debt, I took the necessary legal actions. I filed the official foreclosure paperwork on your house at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon. The county judge already signed the expedited order. By Monday morning, the bank will officially seize your property. You will be evicted from your massive glass and steel home before the end of the month. Your cars will be towed away, and your remaining bank accounts are already frozen pending the civil asset seizure. You have absolutely nothing left, Derek. You are completely bankrupt." Derek slumped back in his chair, the physical reality of his total destruction crushing him into the leather cushions. He stared at the ceiling, his breathing shallow and rapid, completely unable to process the magnitude of his sudden downfall. He had walked into this restaurant expecting to celebrate a massive influx of stolen cash. Instead, he was leaving with his entire life reduced to absolute ashes. But the demolition was not entirely complete. I slowly shifted my cold gaze away from my broken son and looked directly at Stephanie. She was staring at the spilled water soaking into the tablecloth, her entire body trembling uncontrollably. She had remained entirely silent during Derek's financial execution, desperately hoping she could somehow remain invisible in the blast radius. She thought the worst was over. She was entirely wrong. "And as for the black credit card lying right there on the table, Stephanie," I said, my voice dropping into a low, terrifying register that made her flinch violently. She looked up at me, tears of pure terror welling in her heavily mascaraed eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense pressure. "Please, Richard. I can explain everything. I was just trying to help Derek maintain his professional image. We needed to look successful to attract new clients. It was just a temporary solution to a very stressful problem." "You did not borrow money for a temporary solution," I corrected her sharply, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You committed a massive, premeditated federal crime. I know exactly how you opened that exclusive account. I know you used Diane's clean name. I know you deliberately stole the social security number of a paralyzed 68-year-old woman to aggressively fund your pathetic, hollow lifestyle of designer handbags and expensive dinners." Stephanie let out a loud, pathetic sob, covering her face with her shaking hands, as the undeniable truth of her actions was finally dragged out into the harsh light of reality. "I had my private investigator compile a massive, undeniable dossier containing every single fraudulent purchase you made over the last 6 months." I continued, leaning closer to her across the table. "I handed that entire thick file directly over to the Federal Fraud Department this afternoon. They immediately froze the accounts, as your manager just kindly informed you. But that is only the first step. Stealing a disabled elderly woman's social security number and racking up $80,000 in fraudulent charges is not a minor civil dispute. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal prison." Stephanie completely broke down. The arrogant, cruel woman who had spent years humiliating my wife, the woman who had callously ordered the waiter to refuse payment for Diane's meal just 20 minutes ago, was now openly weeping in the middle of the luxury restaurant. Her heavy designer makeup ran down her face in ugly dark streaks. She slid entirely out of her chair and dropped to her knees right there on the polished hardwood floor, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the wealthy patrons surrounding our table. She crawled awkwardly on her knees toward Diane's wheelchair. "Diane, please," Stephanie sobbed hysterically, reaching out with her trembling hands to grasp the fabric of Diane's navy blue dress. "Please forgive me. I am so incredibly sorry. I never meant to actually hurt you. Please do not let him send me to federal prison. I will pay back every single penny, I promise. I know I was cruel. I know I said terrible things in the kitchen, but I was just so stressed about the money. I do not want to go to jail. Please, Diane, you are a good Christian woman. You have a kind heart. You have to show me absolute mercy. You have to tell him to stop this. I am begging you." Diane looked down at the weeping, pathetic woman, groveling on the floor at her feet. For years, Diane had absorbed Stephanie's cruel insults in absolute silence, enduring the emotional abuse to keep the fragile peace in our family. But tonight, Diane did not look away. She did not offer a soft word of comfort. She simply reached out with her good hand, gently pried Stephanie's desperate fingers off her dress, and slowly turned her face away, staring blankly out the large glass window of the restaurant. The silent rejection was absolute and completely devastating. Derek slowly turned his head, looking at me with dead, hollow eyes. The arrogant, successful broker was entirely gone. In his place sat a terrified, ruined little boy who had finally realized the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless greed. "Dad, Derek stammers, his voice barely a whisper, choking on his own tears. Dad, please. You cannot actually do this to us. We are your family. I am your only son. I made a terrible mistake, but I can fix this. I can get a new job. Just call off the lawyers. Please, I am begging you to give me one more chance. I looked at him for the long, silent moment. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no regret. The heavy burden of fatherhood had finally been completely lifted from my shoulders, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth. I don't have a son. The profound silence that followed my final words was absolute and unbreakable. Derek knelt there beside the table, completely paralyzed by the sheer weight of the reality I had just dropped upon him. The facade of the powerful commercial real estate broker was entirely gone, completely stripped away, to reveal a terrified, broken man who had finally reached the very end of his deceptive road. Beside him on the polished floor, Stephanie continued to sob uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands, her designer clothes stained with spilled water, and the harsh truth of her impending federal imprisonment. I looked at both of them one last time, completely severing the remaining emotional threads that tied my heart to their toxic existence. I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I did not feel a sudden rush of paternal guilt. I only felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of lightness, as if a massive steel beam that had been pressing down on my chest for years had finally been lifted by a crane. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and pulled out a thick silver money clip. I slowly peeled off 3 crisp, brand-new $100 bills. I laid them neatly on the dry edge of the white linen tablecloth next to the heavy leather folder. This money was more than enough to cover the cost of the salmon Diane had barely touched and the glass of water I had ordered. I then peeled off 5 more $100 bills and placed them in a separate, neat stack. This was a massive tip designated for the young, nervous waiter who endured Stephanie's arrogance, and for Vincent, the stoic manager who executed his part with absolute precision. I returned the silver money clip to my pocket and buttoned my suit jacket. I stepped out of the booth, standing tall and perfectly straight. I walked around the heavy oak table, completely ignoring Derek's whispered pleas for a second chance. I stepped carefully around Stephanie's trembling form on the floor, ensuring my polished leather shoes did not touch her expensive clothing. I moved behind Diane's wheelchair and placed my hands firmly on the rubber grips. I leaned down and whispered softly that it was finally time to go home. I disengaged the metal brakes and slowly turned the wheelchair around, pointing us toward the front entrance. As we moved through the dimly lit dining room, the atmosphere was surreal. Every patron in our section had stopped eating. The wealthy couples and business executives were all staring at us in stunned silence. They had witnessed the complete unmasking of a fraudulent couple and the cold retribution of an old man pushed entirely too far. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, guiding Diane smoothly past the mahogany tables and the soft jazz music. With every single step I took toward the exit, the air felt cleaner and infinitely more breathable. As we approached the grand front entrance, I saw the heavy glass and brass doors swing open wide. The cool night air of Chicago rushed into the warm lobby. Stepping through the doors were 2 large, imposing police officers in dark blue uniforms. Their heavy duty belts clinked softly as they walked, their expressions completely serious. They were responding to a highly specific federal fraud complaint filed earlier that afternoon by Mitchell. The officers walked purposefully into the restaurant, their eyes scanning the crowded room. I gently pulled Diane's wheelchair slightly to the left, giving the officers plenty of room to pass by us. They did not even glance in my direction. They marched straight past the host stand, walking with deliberate purpose directly toward the back corner booth where a ruined man and a weeping federally indicted woman were waiting for their inevitable fate. I did not stop to turn around and watch the arrest. I did not need to see the cold steel handcuffs clicking around Stephanie's wrists. My part in their story was officially and permanently over. I pushed the wheelchair through the entrance, leaving the restaurant, the toxic drama, and my former son entirely behind me in the shadows. The cool breeze felt absolutely magnificent, as we waited under the bright lights for the valet to bring my truck. I looked down at Diane. She reached her good hand up and gently patted my arm, offering me an incredibly peaceful smile. For the first time in many years, her eyes were completely clear, devoid of the lingering terror that Stephanie and Derek had forced upon her. The cancer had been surgically removed from our lives. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of rapid legal action. I officially foreclosed on the massive house in Lincoln Park. The bank evicted Derek, seizing absolutely everything he owned to satisfy the shadow debt. Stephanie was formally charged with multiple counts of identity theft and federal wire fraud, facing a mandatory minimum sentence that ensured she would remain in a prison cell for a very long time. With the threats neutralized, Diane and I made a final life-changing decision. We sold our modest house in Chicago, leaving behind the cold winters forever. Using my hidden retirement accounts, we purchased a luxury condominium in a quiet community on the coast of Florida. We now spend our mornings drinking coffee on a private lanai, overlooking the calm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The warm southern sun has done absolute wonders for Diane's continued physical recovery, and the profound peace has restored my soul. Doing the right thing requires making the most painful decisions imaginable. I had to completely destroy my own son to save my wife and my own dignity. I had to become cold, calculating, and entirely ruthless. But looking at Diane smiling in the warm Florida sunshine today, I know with absolute certainty that I would do it all over again without a single second of hesitation. You cannot allow toxic people, even if they share your own blood, to drain the life from your veins and destroy the foundation of your peace. You have to stand up, you have to fight back, and you have to protect the people who truly matter. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I hope it brings courage to anyone dealing with abusive family members. You are never as helpless as they want you to believe. Please let me know which city you are listening from right now. I always love reading your comments and seeing where my stories travel. Let's meet down in the comments and discuss what you would have done. If you liked my story and want to support the channel, please consider sending a super thanks. It helps me continue sharing these important life lessons with all of you. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. On your screen right now, you will see 2 more incredible life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and I will see you all in the next video. With all my love and deepest respect.